The Nazca Desert does not look like a place where stories survive. It looks like a place where everything should disappear. The ground is pale and cracked, scattered with stones bleached almost white by centuries of sunlight. The air is so dry it feels thin, as if even moisture has forgotten how to exist here. Sound barely travels. Wind moves slowly and softly, brushing the surface without disturbing it, as if the land itself has learned to stay still. Nothing grows tall. Nothing decays quickly. Nothing changes in a hurry. This stillness is not empty. It is careful. The desert preserves. It holds on. Where rain would wash, Nazca keeps. Where forests would swallow, Nazca exposes. Every footprint lingers longer than it should. Every mark resists time in a way that feels unnatural for a living world. This is not a landscape that erases history. It is a landscape that stores it, layer by layer, line by line, without judgment or explanation. The desert becomes a kind of memory surface, a vast open page that refuses to turn itself. At first, there seems to be nothing written on it. Just stones, just dust, just distance stretching outward until the horizon fades into pale air. But then the idea enters quietly. A gentle unease, a sense that the stillness is not as blank as it appears, that the surface has been touched, that something has been placed here deliberately and left behind on purpose. And once that thought settles in, it becomes impossible to unsee. Long lines run across the desert floor, straighter than rivers, longer than roads. Shapes unfold across the land, with curves too smooth to be accidental and edges too precise to be natural. Birds, animals, spirals, geometric forms so large they only make sense when seen from above, yet so subtle they almost vanish when you stand inside them. The ground itself has been rearranged into images, scraped clean in careful paths that contrast against the darker stone beneath. They were not carved into the earth. They were revealed from it. The people who made these markings did not build upward. They moved outward. They worked with the surface instead of against it, removing stones, shifting color, creating meaning by subtraction rather than addition. No walls, no monuments, no statues reaching for the sky, only lines pressed into the ground, patient and silent, waiting for what is not clear. These shapes were not made to be admired up close. From the ground they are confusing, fragmented, incomplete. You can walk along them without realizing what you are walking through. You can stand inside a figure and never see it. Their true form only appears when you leave the surface behind and rise into the air, as if the desert itself demands distance before it offers understanding. That alone feels strange. Who creates something they cannot properly see? Who designs messages too large for human eyes? Who leaves art meant for no audience at all? The desert does not answer. It only holds. It holds the lines in place. It keeps their edges sharp. It protects them from wind and water and time in a way no human structure could survive. Empires crumble. Cities fall. Names are forgotten. Yet here, the desert keeps a fragile thing intact for thousands of years, as if it knows its importance even if we do not. Slowly, the land stops feeling like a backdrop and begins to feel like a presence. It watches. It remembers. It becomes the quiet guardian of something humanity made and then walked away from. Not buried, not hidden, simply left behind in open sight, invisible only because no one knew how to look. And now that we have noticed, now that we have seen what the desert has been keeping all along, the question no longer feels like what these markings are. The question becomes why they were trusted to the earth itself, and what kind of people believed the desert would remember them when no one else would. For centuries, the Nazca Desert kept its secret without resistance. People crossed it on foot, guided animals through it, and settled near its edges, never realizing that the ground beneath them was not blank at all. From human height, the land offered only stones and dust, heat and distance, a surface too quiet to seem meaningful. The lines were there, but they were folded into the scale of the earth itself, stretched so wide that the human eye could not gather them into form. Then, without meaning to, humanity changed its height. In the early decades of flight, small planes began to cross the Peruvian desert, carrying mail, explorers, and curious travelers along new aerial paths. The engines were loud, the cabins cramped, the air thin and unfamiliar. Below them, the world flattened into patterns of color and shadow, rivers turning into silver threads, mountains into folded cloth. And then, somewhere over the Nazca Plateau, the ground stopped looking natural. Straight lines appeared first, cutting across the desert with a precision that felt out of place in such a wild environment. They ran for kilometers without bending, without wavering, as if drawn with a ruler no human hand could hold. Then curves emerged, spirals, shapes that did not belong to geology or erosion or chance. A bird with wings outstretched, a monkey with a curling tail, a spider, a whale, a flower, and forms that seemed to hover between geometry and life. From the sky, the desert was no longer empty. It was organized. Pilots reported their confusion with the simple language of people who had seen something they could not yet explain. They described lines that looked like roads but led nowhere, shapes that resembled animals but were far too large to be meaningful drawings. What they had discovered did not feel like art. It felt like structure. It felt intentional, in a way that made the mind uneasy, as if the land itself had been arranged according to a plan humanity had never been invited to understand. The contrast was unsettling. A person walking the desert would notice nothing unusual, just rocks beneath their feet, heat above their head, and silence all around. But from the air, that same person would see order stretched across the earth like a hidden grid, a language written too large for the body that created it. The realization came gently, and then all at once. These markings were never meant for eyes on the ground. They were designed for a viewpoint that did not exist when they were made. That thought alone was enough to disturb the calm of discovery. It suggested foresight, or patience, or a belief that someone, someday, would rise high enough to see what had been placed there. The lines had waited centuries without an audience, held intact by the desert, preserved like a message sealed in glass. The first photographs taken from above confirmed what the eyes struggled to accept. The images showed vast compositions that only made sense as a whole, their meaning emerging not from any single line, but from the relationships between them. They were not decorations scattered across the land. They were parts of a system. The desert had been turned into a canvas so large it required the sky to complete it. This changed the lines from curiosities into questions. Who plans something that cannot be seen? Who creates a message and then leaves it unread for 1,000 years? The discovery did not feel like uncovering a ruin or finding a forgotten object. It felt like activating something that had always been there, waiting quietly for the right moment to become visible. The desert had not hidden the lines. Humanity had simply been too small to notice them. Flight did not create the mystery. It revealed it. Once seen, the lines could not return to being invisible. The knowledge of them changed how the land itself was perceived. The desert was no longer empty space between destinations. It became a deliberate surface, marked by intelligence, shaped by intention, and preserved by time. The ground beneath ordinary steps now carried extraordinary meaning. And with that shift came the next, unavoidable question. If these markings were not made for those who walked the earth, then who were they made for? And what kind of people could imagine a future in which their messages would finally be seen? The people who shaped the Nazca Desert left behind no books, no inscriptions, no carved stories explaining who they were or what they believed. They did not record themselves in stone, or metal, or ink. What they left behind instead was movement. They left behind paths, lines, and shapes drawn directly onto the earth, as if the land itself was their language. They had no written script, no metal blades, no wheels to move heavy loads, no horses or oxen to pull tools across long distances, no towers, no scaffolds, no raised platforms from which to observe their work. By every modern measure of progress, they were simple. And yet what they created was anything but. The Nazca Lines stretch across kilometers of desert with a precision that challenges even modern surveying. Straight lines run farther than the eye can comfortably follow, never drifting, never curving, never hesitating. Shapes mirror one another across wide distances. Curves hold consistent proportions. Angles repeat with quiet accuracy. Nothing about them feels accidental, and yet they were made by people standing on the ground. The process itself was surprisingly gentle. The Nazca did not cut into the earth or carve deep channels into stone. They simply moved the surface aside. Darker stones were lifted and placed along the edges, revealing lighter soil beneath. Contrast did the rest. A line appeared not because something was built, but because something was removed. The desert was not forced into a new form. It was persuaded into revealing one. This meant the lines were fragile by design. A strong wind could blur them. Rain could wash them away. Time could erase them easily. Except the desert did not offer those things. The dryness protected what human hands had made. The stillness kept it intact. The Nazca seemed to understand this, choosing a place where the earth itself would become their guardian. Still, the question remains. How does a person draw a straight line for kilometers without being able to see it? How does a group coordinate shapes so large that no one can ever stand far enough away to understand the whole? The answer is not magic. It is patience. It is planning. It is collective memory and shared rules and repeated measurement. It is people walking back and forth across open land, marking, checking, adjusting, and trusting a design they cannot yet fully perceive. It is intelligence expressed not through machines, but through coordination, through ritual, through agreement. This makes the lines more impressive, not less. They are not the product of advanced tools. They are the product of advanced thinking. The Nazca were not primitive dreamers wandering in the dust. They were organizers. They were observers of space and time. They understood how the desert behaved, how long a mark would last, how far a line could travel before it disappeared into distance. They understood scale not as something to be seen, but as something to be felt, counted, walked, and remembered. Each line represents hours of human movement. Each shape represents cooperation across generations. Children would have grown into adults, walking the same paths their parents once traced. The lines were not made in a moment. They were made in lives. This reframes the mystery. The problem is not how they did it. The problem is why they cared enough to do it at all. Why commit such effort to something invisible from the ground? Why invest generations into images no one could stand back and admire? Why make something so precise when no one could verify its precision? These questions transform the Nazca from builders into thinkers, from laborers into planners, from simple people into careful ones. They were not trying to impress each other. They were not decorating their home. They were not leaving art behind for visitors. They were doing something else entirely. And now that we understand the builders, their discipline, their patience, and their quiet intelligence, the mystery shifts again. Because if the Nazca were capable of such precision, such restraint, and such long vision, then the patterns they left behind were not casual. They were chosen. And the only remaining question is what those choices were meant to say. The longer you look at the Nazca Lines, the harder it becomes to call them accidental. Randomness has a certain softness to it. It drifts, it clusters, it leaves uneven gaps and irregular edges. It produces noise, not order. But the desert here does not behave like noise. It behaves like intention stretched across space. Straight lines run for miles without bending. Not gently, not approximately, but with a firmness that feels almost stubborn. They cross hills, shallow valleys, and uneven ground without adapting to the terrain, as if the land itself were expected to conform to the line rather than the other way around. Trapezoids widen and narrow with controlled symmetry. Spirals unfold in measured curves that repeat themselves with quiet consistency. Angles recur. Distances echo one another. Nothing about this feels casual. It feels composed. At first, the human mind resists that conclusion. It wants to believe that nature can do this on its own, that erosion, shifting stones, or ancient paths could somehow align themselves into order. But the more closely the lines are examined, the more that explanation begins to weaken. Random processes do not create kilometers of straightness. They do not repeat angles across wide distances. They do not preserve proportions with this level of care. Randomness is messy. This is not. Slowly, the desert begins to look less like a landscape and more like a surface designed to hold information. A page, a grid, a field in which meaning has been arranged rather than merely left behind. The lines are no longer just marks. They become relationships. Distances between lines matter as much as the lines themselves. The placement of a shape matters as much as its form. The desert stops being empty space and starts behaving like a diagram. Once that shift happens, everything changes. The mind stops asking what the lines depict and begins asking what they express. Not animals or figures, but ideas. Not pictures, but patterns. Something closer to language than to art. This is where the mystery deepens. Language usually exists to be read, to be seen, heard, or understood by someone else. But here, the language is written at a scale no human could comfortably read for most of history. It is stretched across open land, requiring height, distance, and perspective before it becomes coherent. It is a message that resists casual viewing. That alone suggests selectivity. If this were decoration, it could be anywhere. If this were ritual, it could be smaller. If this were expression, it could be closer. But instead, it is vast, precise, and placed where only the sky can complete it. This does not feel like something meant for everyday eyes. It feels like something meant to endure. The Nazca Lines do not shout. They do not overwhelm. They wait. They sit quietly in the dust, unchanged for centuries, not demanding attention but ready for it. They behave less like paintings and more like coordinates, less like images and more like structure. The desert is not decorated. It is organized, and organization always implies intention. Once that idea takes hold, the lines begin to feel less mysterious and more deliberate, less strange and more focused. They become a system whose rules we do not yet understand, rather than a puzzle whose pieces are missing. They feel complete, even if their meaning is not. This gives the audience a different role. Not spectator, but reader. Not observer, but interpreter. The lines are no longer just something to look at. They are something to decode. That shift is subtle, but powerful. It moves the story away from archaeology and toward meaning. Away from who made this and toward what this does. Away from tools and hands and into thought. It asks not how something was created, but why it behaves the way it does. And the most unsettling part is not that the lines are structured. It is that the structure is consistent. Consistency suggests rules. Rules suggest knowledge. Knowledge suggests purpose, which leads gently, inevitably, to the next question. If these patterns are not random, then they may be aligned. And if they are aligned, the only thing left to ask is what they are aligned with. When the Nazca Lines are lifted out of the earth and placed into the sky, something unexpected begins to happen. The ground stops being the end of the story and becomes its beginning. Lines that once felt abstract now start pointing outward, away from the desert, toward the horizon, toward rising and setting light, toward moments in time rather than places in space. Some lines aim directly at where the sun touches the edge of the world on certain days of the year. At solstice, at equinox, at the quiet turning points when seasons shift and survival changes with them. In a land where rain is rare and harvest uncertain, time is not an idea. It is a necessity. To know when the sun will turn back, to know when the days will lengthen or shorten, to know when the earth will offer what little it has. The sky becomes a calendar, and the desert becomes its face. Viewed this way, the Nazca are no longer just builders of lines, but watchers of light. They are people who paid attention to shadows, to angles, to the slow, predictable dance of stars across the night. They noticed what repeated and what did not. They remembered where the sun rose in one season and how far it drifted by the next. They watched certain stars return to the same place after long absences. They understood that the sky had its own patterns, and those patterns mattered. So they marked them, not on paper, not in stone tablets, but on the only surface large enough and patient enough to hold them. The desert. Some lines align with the rising of bright stars that would have been visible just before dawn, appearing briefly and then vanishing into daylight. Others stretch toward where constellations sink below the horizon, disappearing for months before returning again. These moments were not decoration. They were signals. They told stories of time moving forward, of cycles completing themselves, of when to wait and when to act. In this light, the Nazca Lines stop being mysterious shapes and start becoming tools. Not tools of metal, but tools of memory. They allowed a culture without writing to remember time itself. Each line held a moment. Each angle held a return. Each direction held a promise that something would happen again. The sun would come back. The stars would return. The seasons would shift, as they always had. The sky could be trusted. That trust mattered. In a desert, where so much feels uncertain, where rain cannot be counted on, and life feels fragile, the sky becomes the only reliable thing. It never forgets its path. It never misses its marks. It moves with patience and precision that no human system can match. To align with it is to align with stability itself. This reframes the Nazca not as dreamers drawing pictures, but as observers building continuity. They were not worshipping the sky. They were listening to it. They were not guessing. They were recording. And they were not doing it for beauty. They were doing it for survival. But this explanation, calm and practical as it is, does not answer everything. Because the sky can explain straight lines and directions. It can explain timing and alignment. It can explain why the desert became a map of light and shadow. But it does not explain the animals. It does not explain the spider, the hummingbird, the whale, the monkey, the shapes that feel alive rather than measured. It does not explain why a calendar would need wings or tails or eyes. This is where the story turns again. Because if some lines speak to the sky and some speak in symbols, then the Nazca were not just tracking time. They were telling stories, and whatever those stories were, they were meant to be read not just with the mind, but with the imagination. Which means the next question is not what the lines point to, it is what they mean. The animals of the Nazca Desert do not behave like decoration. They do not fill space for beauty. They do not repeat for ornament. They appear alone, isolated, deliberate, placed where nothing else competes with them. A hummingbird stretches its beak into empty ground. A spider rests in silence. A monkey curls its tail in a shape too careful to be playful. A whale swims through dust where no water has ever flowed. These creatures do not belong here, and that is the point. In a desert defined by dryness, stillness, and scarcity, the Nazca chose to carve life. They chose movement. They chose wings, legs, and flowing forms, in a place that offers none of those things naturally. This contrast turns the animals into symbols before they can become images. They are not representations of what exists. They are representations of what is missing. The hummingbird is a creature of energy and speed, of color and nectar and abundance. It depends on flowering plants, on water, on cycles of growth that the desert barely allows. To place a hummingbird into the earth is to place the idea of fertility into a land that struggles to sustain it. It becomes a wish written into the ground, a reminder of what life needs, a quiet request for renewal. The spider is a weaver. It creates order from empty space, drawing structure from nothing, building connection out of air. It is patient, precise, and invisible when still. In many cultures, spiders represent creation itself, the act of forming something where nothing existed before. In the Nazca Desert, the spider becomes a mirror of the people who made it, weaving lines into emptiness, building meaning where the world appears blank. The monkey is a creature of forests, of play, of social life, of trees and shade and fruit. It does not belong in open, dry land. Its presence feels almost defiant, as if the Nazca were insisting on remembering another world, or perhaps imagining one. The curled tail becomes a loop, a return, a suggestion that what is lost may not be gone forever. And then there is the whale, a creature of depth placed onto the surface of the driest place on earth. Water is life in the desert, not symbolically, but absolutely. Rivers mean survival. Rain means hope. Oceans mean abundance beyond imagination. To carve a whale into the desert is not to honor an animal. It is to honor water itself. It is to honor the idea of life arriving from somewhere beyond the horizon. These figures are not zoology. They are desire. They are fear. They are memory. They reflect what the Nazca depended on and what they lacked. They point toward rain, fertility, continuity, and balance. They do not describe the world as it is. They describe the world as it must be for life to continue. This is why the animals feel out of place. They are not meant to match the land. They are meant to speak to it. The desert becomes not just a surface, but a listener. A place where requests can be made without words, where needs can be shaped into form, where belief can be expressed through geometry and patience instead of prayer and sound. The Nazca did not carve gods into the earth. They carved relationships between sky and ground, between water and dust, between life and absence, between what is and what must come. The animals become bridges between those states. They turn the desert into a conversation rather than a display, a negotiation with nature rather than a celebration of it. This does not make the Nazca mystical in a careless way. It makes them practical in a symbolic one. They understood that survival in a fragile environment depends not only on tools and knowledge, but on attention, memory, and meaning. The symbols hold those things together. They carry the emotional weight of survival in a way numbers cannot. And once symbols enter the story, the lines stop being maps and start becoming messages. Which means the next step is not understanding what the lines show, it is understanding what the Nazca believed. Because symbols are never created alone. They grow out of ritual, and ritual grows out of belief. The Nazca Lines change their meaning when you stop looking at them and start walking them. From above, they are images. From the ground, they are paths. Wide, clear, and strangely inviting, many of the lines are just the right size for people to move along together, side by side, step after step, without effort or strain. They are not narrow scratches. They are not fragile drawings. They are walkable spaces, laid gently across the desert. Once you step onto one, the world becomes very simple. There is the ground beneath your feet, the sky above your head, and the horizon that never seems to move closer. The stones crunch softly as you walk. The sound is steady and quiet, neither loud enough to distract nor soft enough to disappear. It becomes a rhythm, a metronome for the body. Step, sound, step, sound. The line carries you forward without asking where you are going. There are no turns to decide on, no obstacles to avoid, no landmarks to navigate toward. The line removes choice, and in doing so, it removes noise from the mind. You walk, and you keep walking. The desert does not offer distraction. No trees, no water, no shade, no animals moving in the distance. Just pale earth and wide sky, held together by a thin, straight path that keeps you oriented even when the world feels empty. It is easy to imagine how this could become meditative without anyone intending it to be. The body falls into pace. The breath follows. Thought slows down because there is nothing for it to hold on to. Walking becomes enough. In this state, the line stops being a shape and becomes a container. It holds attention. It shapes awareness. It guides not just the body, but the mind itself, pulling it out of scattered thought and into simple presence. You are here. You are moving. You are part of something longer than yourself. This is what ritual often does. Across cultures and history, people have created paths not to go somewhere, but to become something along the way. Labyrinths that turn inward, pilgrimage roads that stretch across countries, processional routes that repeat the same movement generation after generation. These are not practical roads. They are psychological tools. They use motion to change the inner state of the one who moves. The Nazca Lines feel like this. They do not rush you. They do not challenge you. They do not reward you with a destination. They offer only continuation. The end of a line is not a climax. It is simply where the line stops. The meaning is not in arrival. It is in the act of walking itself. This changes how we understand the people who made them. They were not just drawing on the land. They were shaping experience. They were building spaces where humans could step out of ordinary life and into something quieter, slower, and more focused. A place where the mind could soften, where attention could narrow, where the weight of daily survival could loosen its grip for a while. In such a state, symbols feel different. Belief feels closer. The line beneath your feet is not just earth. It is intention made physical. It is memory made walkable. It is a story you do not hear, but feel. And that feeling matters. Because when the body moves in a certain way for a long enough time, the mind follows. It becomes receptive. It becomes open. It becomes less concerned with explanation and more willing to accept meaning without demanding proof. This is not weakness. It is how humans have always prepared themselves for things that feel larger than language. The Nazca may not have seen their lines from the sky, but they felt them from the ground. They felt their length. They felt their direction. They felt their patience. And through that feeling, the desert stopped being empty and became something alive with purpose. Once you understand the lines as paths rather than pictures, the mystery shifts again. Because if the lines were meant to be walked, then walking was meant to change something, and the only remaining question is what state of mind that change was meant to lead into. The human mind does not need walls to change. It needs rhythm. It needs repetition. It needs simplicity long enough for complexity to fade. This is why chanting works, why breathing practices work, why people walk in circles, repeat phrases, or follow the same movements again and again when they are seeking something quieter than ordinary thought. The Nazca did not need temples to enter. They created patterns that slowly turned the mind itself into the temple. Long, straight paths remove decision. You do not choose where to go. You simply continue. This alone alters attention. The part of the mind that plans and predicts begins to rest. There is nothing to solve, nothing to avoid, nothing to prepare for. The body moves and the mind follows, gradually releasing its grip on time, on self, on urgency. Geometry intensifies this effect. A curve pulls awareness inward. A spiral draws it deeper. A straight line stretches it outward. A repeating angle gently hypnotizes it. These forms are not neutral. They shape perception. They guide attention the way music guides emotion. The Nazca Lines are not just shapes on the ground. They are shapes placed into awareness through movement. The desert completes the system. Silence removes social noise. Heat slows the body. Distance erases reference points. The horizon offers no detail for the eye to cling to. The mind is left with only itself and the act of walking. In this environment, thoughts rise and fall without interruption. Feelings become clearer. Memory becomes louder. Inner images begin to feel as real as outer ones. This is not fantasy, it is human psychology. When sensory input drops and repetition rises, the brain shifts into a different mode of awareness. Time stretches. Boundaries soften. The sense of separation between self and world becomes less firm. The mind becomes receptive rather than analytical. It listens instead of speaks. This is what trance is. Not unconsciousness, not escape, but a narrowing of attention so deep that it becomes expansive. In such a state, meaning does not need explanation. It is felt. Symbols do not need translation. They resonate. The animals carved into the desert stop being images and start becoming presences. The sky stops being distant and starts feeling intimate. The earth stops being passive and starts feeling responsive. The Nazca Lines make sense in this context. They are not meant to impress the eye. They are meant to shape awareness. They are architecture for the mind. The Nazca did not raise walls around sacred space. They stretched sacred space across the land itself. They did not build upward toward the divine. They built outward into the human experience of the world. They did not separate ritual from daily life. They embedded it into movement, into walking, into the simple act of crossing the desert. This kind of design is subtle. It does not announce itself. It works slowly. It works quietly. It works by repetition, not by force. A person could walk the same line many times and each time experience it differently. Once in grief, once in hope, once in gratitude, once in fear. The line remains the same. The mind changes. This makes the lines reusable, adaptable, alive in a way stone buildings cannot be. They are not frozen in one meaning. They are open to the one who enters them. This is what makes them powerful. They do not tell you what to think. They create a space where something can happen, and that something is internal. Once you see the Nazca Lines this way, the question shifts again. Not what are they, not how were they built, but what were they built for? If geometry can change consciousness, then geometry can be used for intention, for prayer, for request, for offering, for asking the world to respond. Which means the lines were not just walked, they were used, and whatever they were used for was important enough to shape an entire landscape around it. This brings us gently to the next layer of the mystery. If the Nazca Lines shaped inner experience, then they were likely part of communication. not between people, but between humans and something they believed could hear them. When a world cannot be controlled, it is negotiated with. This is not superstition. It is psychology shaped by survival. In a land where rain does not obey calendars and rivers do not follow promises, the only power left to humans is attention, patience, and ritual. The Nazca did not command the desert. They listened to it, and in listening, they began to speak. The lines became that speech. They were not letters. They were not words. They were actions repeated with care. Shapes walked with intention, symbols placed where the earth itself could feel them. The Nazca could not pull rain from the sky or water from stone, but they could offer something back. Time, effort, focus, beauty. They could shape the land in a way that showed respect, awareness, and hope. This is what ritual is. It is not an attempt to force reality. It is an attempt to be heard by it. The Nazca walked their lines, carrying more than their bodies. They carried questions. They carried fears about drought, hunger, illness, and loss. They carried the weight of children yet to be born, and crops yet to grow. Each step was a sentence. Each journey was a request shaped into motion. They did not build altars to place offerings upon. They turned the land itself into the altar. The desert received their movement, their breath, their silence. It received their symbols carved gently into its surface, not as scars, but as gestures. A hummingbird for fertility, a spider for creation, a whale for water beyond sight. These were not decorations. They were languages without grammar, meanings without sound. The act of walking was the offering. The act of shaping was the prayer. And the act of repeating was the belief. From this perspective, the Nazca Lines stop being mysterious constructions and become intimate ones. They become expressions of vulnerability rather than power. They reveal a people who understood that they lived at the mercy of forces larger than themselves, and instead of pretending otherwise, they responded with humility. They asked rather than demanded. They offered rather than took. They shaped rather than consumed. This kind of belief is quiet. It does not build towering monuments. It does not carve faces into mountains or raise statues into the sky. It leaves little behind except traces of care. The Nazca did not leave messages for future humans. They left messages for the world. Whether the world answered is unknown. Whether rain came because of the lines or in spite of them cannot be measured. Whether the rituals worked in any physical sense cannot be proven. But that is not the point. The point is that the Nazca believed relationship mattered more than control. They believed that how you move through the world shapes how the world responds to you. They believed that intention could travel through land, through time, through silence, and reach something beyond immediate understanding. So they walked. They walked the same paths again and again, not because they expected instant reward, but because repetition builds meaning, because meaning builds patience, because patience builds resilience. The lines did not promise rain. They promised continuity. They did not guarantee survival. They offered coherence. They did not claim power. They expressed hope. And hope, in a desert, is not abstract. It is practical. It is what keeps people planting seeds in dry ground. It is what keeps communities together when the sky refuses to respond. It is what turns fear into movement instead of paralysis. The Nazca Lines become a record of that hope, not as emotion, but as action, not as belief, but as behavior. They show a culture that chose to meet uncertainty with ritual rather than despair, which brings the story to its most grounded truth. Because behind every symbol, every line, every ceremony, there was one need that outweighed all others: water. And without it, nothing else mattered. The Nazca Desert is not harsh in a dramatic way. There are no towering storms or roaring winds. There is only absence, an absence so complete it becomes the defining force of life. Rain does not fall here in seasons. It arrives rarely, quietly, and without promise of return. Some years pass with no water at all. Some decades offer only a few brief moments of relief before the sky closes again. In such a place, survival is not a struggle against nature so much as it is a negotiation with uncertainty. Every seed planted is a risk. Every child born is a question. Every year is a test that no one can prepare for in advance. There is no guarantee that tomorrow will provide what today requires. There is only the knowledge that if water does not come, everything else will fail. This creates a quiet tension beneath ordinary life. People wake up not knowing whether the earth will support them this year. They look at the sky, not with simple hope, but with calculation. They listen to the wind not for beauty, but for change. Over time, this constant attention shapes the mind. It turns weather into destiny. It turns clouds into omens. It turns rivers into lifelines. In the Nazca Desert, water is not sacred because it is holy, but because it is rare. Not because it is symbolic, but because it decides everything. Without water, crops do not grow. Without crops, communities do not survive. Without survival, culture dissolves. Knowledge fades. Language disappears. Memory becomes dust. This is why mistakes are not forgiven here. There is no margin. There is no backup. There is no safety net beneath failure. One season without rain does not bring inconvenience, it brings hunger. 2 seasons bring migration. 3 bring collapse. This reality would have been known intimately by the Nazca, not as an idea, but as experience passed down through generations. Stories of years when the rivers dried. Stories of families who left and never returned. Stories of fields that became dust and stayed that way forever. The desert remembers these things. It holds the traces of abandoned settlements and forgotten paths as quietly as it holds the lines themselves. The land is a record not only of what humans built, but of what they lost. That knowledge would have lived inside the people. Every ritual, every line, every symbol becomes heavier in this context. They are no longer abstract gestures. They are attempts to maintain balance in a world that offers none. They are ways of coping with a reality that does not respond to effort or fairness. You can do everything right and still fail. You can plant carefully and still starve. You can pray, plan, and prepare, and still lose. This kind of environment creates a particular kind of consciousness. It makes people attentive. It makes them patient. It makes them humble. It also makes them afraid, not in a loud way, but in a quiet, steady way that sits behind every decision. The Nazca did not fear the desert as an enemy. They feared it as a judge, a silent one, an unchanging one that did not argue, one that did not explain, one that simply responded with life or with absence. This is why water becomes the center of everything, not as a resource, but as a relationship, not as a thing to be taken, but as something to be found, protected, and guided. The Nazca did not live beside rivers that could be seen. They lived above rivers that were hidden. Beneath the desert, far below the dust and stone, water moved slowly through underground channels, invisible and unreachable without knowledge. It did not announce itself. It did not reveal where it flowed. It waited to be understood, and misunderstanding it meant death. This is the final pressure the desert applies. It does not just demand survival, it demands precision. You cannot dig randomly. You cannot search blindly. You cannot guess where water is. You must know. You must observe. You must listen to the land in ways that are almost impossible to explain. The Nazca were not just living in a dry place. They were living in a place that punished error, which means that everything they did around water had to be careful, intentional, respectful, and informed. And that brings us to the next layer of their story, because somehow, in a land that offers no forgiveness for mistakes, the Nazca found water anyway. The Nazca could not make rain, but they learned how to find what the desert tried to hide. Beneath the cracked surface and pale stones, far below the reach of heat and wind, water moved slowly through underground veins carved by time itself. These hidden flows were not obvious, not visible, and not easy to reach, but they existed, and the Nazca discovered them. Instead of trying to reshape the sky, they reshaped their relationship with the earth. They built spiraled openings into the ground, wide enough for people to descend, leading into underground channels that collected and guided water from deep aquifers toward their settlements and fields. These structures, called puquios, were not dramatic monuments. They were practical, precise, and quietly revolutionary. From above, a puquio looks like a simple spiral cut into the land, but from within, it is an engineering system that reveals deep understanding of airflow, gravity, and hydrology. The spiral shape is not decorative. It allows wind to flow downward into the tunnel, pushing fresh air through the underground channels and keeping the water moving and clean. It stabilizes the tunnel walls against collapse. It provides access for maintenance and repair. The Nazca created a living system that could breathe, adapt, and survive across generations, one that functioned invisibly while supporting everything visible above it. Their most advanced architecture was not built for the eye, but for life itself. This inversion is striking. The Nazca are remembered for the lines on the surface, yet their greatest achievement may lie beneath it. They mastered underground water management in one of the driest places on Earth, without metal tools, without modern surveying, without written blueprints. They did it through observation, patience, and careful refinement over time. They watched how moisture behaved in soil, how plants responded to subtle changes in ground texture, how certain areas remained cooler or greener than others. They learned to read the land not as scenery, but as a living system with signals and patterns that could be understood. The puquios allowed the Nazca to survive droughts that would have destroyed less attentive societies. They turned unpredictable rainfall into a managed resource, buffering their communities against environmental collapse. Water could now be stored, guided, and shared. Crops could grow where none should have been possible. Life could persist where nature alone would have failed. This was not domination of the desert. It was cooperation with it. The Nazca did not force water to appear. They learned how to listen for it, how to trace its hidden paths, and how to invite it gently into human life. This hidden sophistication changes how the Nazca must be understood. They were not only symbolic thinkers and ritual walkers. They were engineers, planners, and system builders. They understood that survival required both meaning and mechanics, both belief and precision. The lines on the surface may speak to psychology and ritual, but the puquios speak to pragmatism and adaptation. Together they form a culture that worked on two levels at once, one that shaped inner experience and one that shaped physical survival. The Nazca did not separate the sacred from the practical. They wove them together. And yet, this raises a quiet question. If water was found, guided, and protected underground, if survival depended on these invisible systems beneath the desert, why were the rituals placed above it? Why carve symbols into the surface instead of honoring the tunnels below? Why walk lines in the open sun instead of performing ceremonies inside the earth that held life itself? The Nazca clearly understood where survival came from, yet they chose to place their symbols not where water flowed, but where sky, earth, and human movement met. This choice suggests that water was not only a resource to be managed, but a relationship to be acknowledged, something that required more than engineering to sustain. The Pukios show that the Nazca could solve physical problems with intelligence and care, but the lines suggest they were also responding to something emotional, psychological, or existential about living in such a fragile world. They were not only trying to survive, they were trying to belong. They were not only drawing water from the earth, they were trying to stay in conversation with it. And that is why the desert above remained a space of ritual, even while the true lifelines ran quietly beneath it. What begins to emerge, once the Pukios are understood, is a different way of seeing the lines themselves. The desert stops looking like a canvas and starts behaving like a diagram. The shapes no longer feel expressive but functional, not emotional but informational. Lines stretch across land the way currents stretch across water, revealing invisible movement through visible form. The Nazca may not have been drawing pictures at all. They may have been tracing what could not be seen. Beneath the ground, water moved through hidden channels. Above the ground, lines mirrored movement, flow, and connection. The surface became a language for the underground, a way to hold memory about what lay beyond human sight. In a land where water could not be trusted to appear, knowledge of where it traveled would have been everything. Subtle variations in vegetation, temperature, soil color, and moisture would have revealed clues to trained observers. The Nazca learned to read these signals and translate them into stable forms. A line could mark a flow, a shape could record a pattern, a spiral could symbolize movement from depth to surface. Over time, this became a map that did not sit on paper but lived within the land itself. The desert became a memory system, storing knowledge not in writing but in geometry large enough to survive centuries. This reframing transforms the lines from mysteries into instructions. Not commands, not orders, but guides. A record of where life had once been found, where it might be found again, and how it could be protected. The lines became a way of teaching future generations how to survive without words. A child walking a line was not only participating in ritual, but absorbing information through movement. Knowledge was passed through experience rather than explanation. The desert itself became the teacher, and the lines were its lesson plan, written slowly across time. Seen this way, the Nazca lines are not irrational at all. They are careful, restrained, and deeply logical. They do not point toward power, but toward continuity. They do not display wealth or authority. They preserve understanding. They are not messages for the sky or for gods, but for people who had not yet been born. A future-proof system of knowledge embedded into geography, protected by dryness, silence, and scale. While cities collapse and languages vanish, a line in the desert can remain. The Nazca did not trust memory alone. They trusted land. Yet even this explanation does not fully exhaust the meaning of the lines. Because humans rarely create things for only one reason. Survival alone does not explain beauty. Utility alone does not explain care. Instruction alone does not explain symbolism. The Nazca were not only mapping water, they were mapping meaning. They were mapping their dependence on forces they could not control, and their relationship to a world that sustained and threatened them at the same time. The lines were not only practical, they were reflective. This is why the desert remains both a diagram and a story, both a system and a symbol. The Nazca lines carry information, but they also carry emotion. They record where water moved, but they also express what water meant. They map survival, but they also map fear, hope, patience, and attention. The same line that marks a flow can also become a path of prayer. The same spiral that guides air underground can also guide the mind inward. The desert becomes layered with function and feeling, instruction and interpretation, necessity and reverence. This dual nature is what gives the Nazca Lines their enduring power. They refuse to stay in one category. They are not just science. They are not just art. They are not just ritual. They are a culture written into space, a way of thinking made visible, a conversation between humans and a land that does not forgive mistakes but does preserve memory. The lines do not explain themselves. They wait to be understood by those willing to listen slowly enough. And this brings the story full circle. From mystery to meaning, from wonder to function, from symbol to system and back again. Because once the lines are seen as maps, and maps are seen as stories, the distinction between instruction and belief dissolves. The Nazca did not choose between survival and symbolism. They united them. And in doing so, they left behind something that is neither purely practical nor purely sacred, but quietly, deeply human. What slowly becomes visible is that the Nazca did not simply live inside their environment. They lived according to it. The lines did not sit beside society like artwork on a wall. They shaped movement, attention, gathering, and rhythm. They directed where people walked, where they stopped, where they turned, and where they lingered. Over generations, these patterns would have become habit, and habit would have become culture. The landscape itself acted like a script written into space, guiding behavior without words or enforcement. People did not need laws to tell them where to go, because the ground already suggested it. They did not need schedules, because the sky and the lines created time. The desert became a structure that organized life quietly and continuously. Children would grow up walking certain paths, because those were the paths that existed. Families would meet at specific intersections, because those were the places that felt designed for gathering. Ceremonies would repeat in the same spaces, because repetition makes meaning stable. Over time, this would feel natural rather than imposed. No one would experience the lines as control. They would experience them as normality. The land would teach people how to move, how to wait, how to align, and how to pay attention. Behavior would be shaped not through command, but through design. The environment would do what rulers usually do, but without speaking, watching, or punishing. This is what makes the Nazca system so subtle. It does not tell people what to believe. It creates conditions in which certain beliefs emerge. It does not demand obedience. It gently removes alternatives. When movement is guided, thought follows. When attention is shaped, meaning follows. When experience is structured, identity follows. The lines become a silent teacher that works over lifetimes rather than moments. They are not instructions. They are tendencies. They do not force agreement. They create coherence. Society becomes synchronized not because people are told to agree, but because they are guided to experience the world in similar ways. In this sense, the Nazca landscape functions like an operating system for human behavior. It defines what actions are easy, what actions are rare, what actions are repeated, and what actions feel significant. Walking the lines becomes normal. Gathering at intersections becomes expected. Aligning with the sky becomes meaningful. Over time, these patterns shape belief, and belief shapes culture. The system is not centralized. No one owns it. No one controls it. It persists because it is embedded into the world itself. It is governance without rulers, structure without hierarchy, order without force. This explains why the lines are so large and so persistent. They are not built to be impressive. They are built to be unavoidable. You cannot cross the desert without encountering them. You cannot grow up there without walking them. You cannot imagine the land without them. They become the invisible framework within which life unfolds. The Nazca did not need to teach their children their values explicitly, because those values were reinforced by daily movement, daily rhythm, and daily attention. The land itself became the curriculum. Seen this way, The Nazca Lines are not passive relics. They are active systems. They do not represent society. They generate it. They shape how people think about time, about space, about nature, about themselves. They make certain thoughts feel natural, and others feel strange. They normalize patience. They normalize attention. They normalize humility before forces larger than human life. The result is a culture that feels aligned not because it is uniform, but because it is rhythmically consistent. And this is why the lines outlasted the society that made them. Societies change, beliefs shift, languages vanish, but when structure is embedded into geography, it persists beyond politics, beyond memory, beyond intention. The Nazca Lines continue to shape movement even when the Nazca themselves are gone. They still guide footsteps. They still organize space. They still influence perception. The system remains active long after its creators disappeared. This is perhaps the most unsettling idea of all. That a culture can be written so deeply into a place that it continues to function without its people. That belief can be embedded into stone and dust. That behavior can be programmed into the land itself. The Nazca did not just build a society. They encoded one into the desert. And in doing so, they created something that does not record who they were, but preserves how they lived. A symbol begins as an idea, but it does not stay an idea for long. The moment it is repeated, the mind gives it weight. The moment it is shared, the mind gives it shape. The moment it is acted out again and again, the mind gives it reality. This is not imagination in a childish sense, but the way human psychology turns meaning into experience. The Nazca Lines were not just symbols drawn on the earth, they were symbols walked, touched, remembered, and reenacted until they stopped feeling symbolic at all. Each time someone walked a line, the meaning of that line deepened. Each time a group gathered at a shape, the shape became more than a shape and turned into a place, a location not only in space, but in memory. Over generations, this repetition would turn abstract patterns into emotional anchors. People would not think of the hummingbird as a drawing, they would feel it as a presence. They would not think of the spiral as a shape, they would feel it as a transition. The lines would move from the outside world into the inner world, from geometry into identity. This is how belief becomes embodied. The human mind is not convinced by arguments. It is convinced by experience, by what the body does and feels over time. When movement, attention, emotion, and story align, something shifts. The symbol stops being a reference and starts being a reality. The line is no longer a representation of a path, it becomes the path. The spiral is no longer a metaphor for descent or return, it becomes descent and return. The symbol collapses into the thing it points to. This creates a feedback loop in which belief shapes behavior, behavior reinforces belief, and belief deepens behavior. Over time, this loop becomes self-sustaining. The original reason for the symbol may be forgotten, but the effect remains. People continue to walk because walking feels meaningful. They continue to gather because gathering feels necessary. They continue to repeat because repetition feels right. The system no longer requires explanation, it only requires participation. This is why symbols are so powerful. They do not need to be defended or proven, they only need to be lived. The Nazca Lines became a living mythology, not a story told in words, but a story enacted through movement and space. It was not written in books, it was written into the body. Children learned it by walking, adults reinforced it by repeating, and elders preserved it by remembering. The culture did not live in minds alone, it lived in habits. Habits feel real, more real than ideas, and more trustworthy than theories. They feel like the way the world is. This is how symbols become reality, not because they are true in an objective sense, but because they become true in a psychological sense. They shape what people notice, what they care about, what they fear, and what they hope for. They turn attention into direction and direction into identity. In this way, the Nazca Lines were not just expressions of belief, they were engines of belief. They generated the very reality they seemed to describe. They turned meaning into motion, motion into memory, and memory into culture. This also explains why such systems are so resilient, because you can destroy a book, erase a story, or silence a teacher, but you cannot easily erase a habit, remove a rhythm from a culture, or undo something that lives in the body. As long as people walk the lines continue to work, and as long as the lines work, they continue to shape belief. This is the quiet power of ritual. It does not announce itself, argue, or persuade, it simply repeats until repetition feels like truth. And once something feels like truth, it becomes very difficult to question. That is where the next layer begins, because when belief becomes reality and reality becomes shared, authority starts to emerge, not imposed from above, but growing naturally from within the system itself. Over time, not everyone would have understood the lines in the same way. Some people would walk them, some would feel them, some would obey them, but a smaller group would learn to interpret them. These were the ones who remembered why a certain path curved, why a certain intersection mattered, why a particular shape had to be approached at a certain moment or from a certain direction. They became keepers of context in a culture where context could not be written down. Their authority did not come from force or weapons or wealth. It came from memory, timing, and interpretation. They were not rulers of land or people. They were rulers of meaning. In a society shaped by ritual, meaning is power. To know when a ceremony should begin, when it should end, where it should occur, and how it should be performed is to quietly control the rhythm of communal life. These specialists did not need to command obedience. Participation itself created obedience. When people gathered because gathering felt necessary and moved because movement felt meaningful, those who guided the meaning guided the people. The lines became an interface between everyday life and something larger, and the ones who understood that interface became essential. Their role was not to dominate, but to interpret, to frame, to explain what could not be seen directly. This kind of power is subtle and therefore stable. It does not provoke rebellion because it does not feel imposed. It feels natural. The specialists would not say, "Do this because I say so." They would say, "Do this because this is how the world works." And because the world seemed to respond, because rain sometimes came, because crops sometimes grew, because survival sometimes followed ritual, the explanation felt confirmed. Even when outcomes were uncertain, the structure remained comforting. In uncertainty, people cling not to truth, but to coherence, and the priests of pattern offered coherence in a world that offered very little of it. Over generations, this role would solidify into a social layer. Children born into certain families would learn the deeper stories behind the lines, the symbolic meanings behind the animals, the seasonal timing behind the paths. This knowledge would be passed quietly, carefully, and selectively. Not everyone needed to know everything. Not everyone could be trusted with interpretation. The system worked best when most people experienced it, and only a few explained it. This created a gentle hierarchy, not of privilege, but of access. Access to timing, access to narrative, access to the invisible logic beneath the visible world. Once access becomes unequal, power becomes possible. The lines were no longer just communal tools. They became instruments through which reality could be framed. A drought could be explained as imbalance. A flood could be explained as excess. A sickness could be explained as misalignment. The priests of pattern did not cause these events, but they gave them meaning and meaning shapes response. People do not react to events as they are. They react to what events are said to be. Whoever defines the meaning defines the emotional and social direction of the community. This does not make the priests villains. It makes them human. In fragile environments, stability matters more than freedom. Consistency matters more than questioning. When survival is uncertain, people prefer explanations that reduce anxiety, even if those explanations limit possibility. The priests of pattern provided that reduction. They turned chaos into narrative, randomness into order, and fear into ritual. In doing so, they made life bearable. They also made themselves necessary. This is the quiet transition where symbols become tools, and tools become power. The Nazca Lines began as ways of relating to the world, but over time they became ways of organizing people within it. They did not only shape consciousness, they shaped hierarchy. They created centers of interpretation and edges of participation. They separated those who walked from those who explained walking, those who felt from those who defined feeling. This is where the lines stop being just paths and start becoming institutions, not in stone, but in belief. And once belief becomes structured, it begins to invite something else. It invites stories that go beyond human explanation. It invites forces that cannot be argued with. It invites gods. Across time, meaning drifts. Stories travel further than their origins, and with each generation, the distance between symbol and source grows wider. What begins as a metaphor becomes a memory, and what begins as memory becomes a belief. Eventually, belief hardens into something that feels literal. This is how human culture preserves meaning while also slowly changing it. The Nazca Lines may have begun as a language of relationship between humans, earth, and sky, but that language did not remain intact. It transformed as it moved through time, interpretation, and loss. For the Nazca, the sky was not a place of beings, but a place of patterns. It was a clock, a map, a mirror of cycles that governed life on Earth. The sun did not rule them, it guided them. The stars did not watch them, they marked time for them. The sky was not an authority, but a reference. Its movements offered orientation, not judgment. Its rhythms provided structure, not command. In this context, to speak of the sky was not to speak of gods, but of order. But later cultures encountered the lines without this context. They saw images pointing upward, shapes aligned with rising stars, paths that seemed to aim toward the heavens. Without the lived experience of walking the lines, without the rituals that shaped perception, without the ecological pressures that made the sky a survival tool, the language of alignment was easily misread as the language of worship. A system of orientation became a system of adoration. A metaphor for order became a story of beings who ruled that order. This is how gods enter history, not as visitors, but as misunderstandings, not as arrivals, but as interpretations. When knowledge of function fades, symbol remains. And when symbol remains without explanation, the mind fills the gap with story. The stars become watchers instead of markers. The sun becomes a ruler instead of a clock. The sky becomes populated not with patterns, but with personalities. This shift is subtle but powerful. It moves authority from process to person, from rhythm to will, from system to entity. Once this happens, meaning changes direction. Instead of humans aligning themselves with cycles, they begin to imagine themselves as subjects of powers that control those cycles. Instead of negotiating with nature, they imagine pleading with it. Instead of listening to patterns, they begin to worship imagined agents behind those patterns. The world does not change. The story does, and stories shape behavior as effectively as landscapes do. This transformation does not happen all at once. It happens slowly, across generations, as rituals are repeated without full understanding, as words replace experience, as myths replace memory. Over time, the original intention of the lines fades, but the sense of their importance remains. People continue to feel that the lines matter, that the sky matters, that something larger than human life is present in these spaces. But without knowing why, they begin to ask who. And once you ask who, you are no longer in the realm of pattern. You are in the realm of personification. This is where metaphor becomes literal, where poetry becomes belief, where language becomes reality. The Nazca may have spoken in images and movement. Later cultures spoke in stories and names. The first was experiential, the second was narrative. Neither is wrong, but they are not the same. One points to process, the other points to agency. One says, "This is how the world works." The other says, "This is who runs the world." The difference is small in words, but enormous in consequence. Because once you imagine a ruler behind the system, you also imagine favor and punishment, obedience and disobedience, reward and fear. The world stops being something to align with and becomes something to appease. Ritual stops being a way of listening and becomes a way of asking. The tone of human relationship with reality shifts from cooperation to submission. This is not the invention of deception. It is the inheritance of distance. It is what happens when meaning outlives memory. The gods did not descend from the sky. The story did. And they descended not from above, but from the past, carried forward by people trying to preserve something they no longer fully understood. And this is where the next transformation begins. Because once metaphor becomes literal and story becomes authority, belief no longer just explains the world. It begins to govern it. Modern minds look at the past through the lens of their own time. This is not arrogance so much as habit. We interpret what we see using the tools we know, and today the most powerful tools we have are technological. We think in terms of machines, engineers, visitors from elsewhere, and intelligence expressed through advanced devices. When we look at ancient symbols that feel complex or out of place, the easiest explanation becomes a technological one. If something seems too precise, too vast, or too unfamiliar, we assume it must have come from somewhere beyond ordinary human life. This is how the idea of ancient astronauts takes shape, not from evidence, but from projection. When modern observers see lines that can only be fully appreciated from the air, they imagine flying beings. When they see alignment with stars, they imagine visitors from those stars. When they see knowledge that feels ahead of its time, they imagine outside intervention. In doing so, they replace ancient psychology with modern fantasy. They turn symbolic systems into mechanical ones. They turn cultural intelligence into borrowed technology. This does not come from a lack of respect, but from a lack of fluency. We are fluent in machines and less fluent in metaphor. We understand how satellites work, but we do not easily understand how ritual works. We understand engineering, but we struggle to understand symbolic systems that shape behavior, belief, and perception. So we translate the past into the language of the present, and the Nazca Lines become landing strips, sky alignments become navigation, animal figures become messages, and the humans who created them become either helpers or witnesses, rather than authors. This translation is comforting in a strange way. It allows us to admire ancient achievements without having to acknowledge ancient intelligence. It lets us preserve a sense of modern superiority while still enjoying the mystery. The past becomes exotic but not equal, fascinating but not threatening to our identity as the most advanced humans who have ever lived. But this comfort has a cost, because it removes agency from ancient people, turns their creativity into evidence of someone else's presence, and empties their culture of meaning in order to fill it with our own. In this way, ancient astronaut myths say more about us than about them. They reveal a modern discomfort with symbolic thought, a tendency to distrust meaning that is not measurable, and a habit of replacing psychology with physics, ritual with hardware, and story with machinery. We do not look for aliens because the evidence points there. We look for aliens because we forgot how to read stories. We forgot that humans once encoded knowledge into movement, into landscape, into ritual, into myth. We forgot that intelligence does not only build machines, it builds systems of meaning, cultures that survive through memory, pattern, and repetition. The Nazca did not need visitors from the sky to imagine the sky mattered. They lived under it, depended on it, and watched it shape their seasons, their survival, and their future. To them, the sky was not a mystery, it was a necessity. And when necessity becomes central, it becomes symbolic. This is not evidence of aliens, it is evidence of humanity. The ancient astronaut narrative replaces that humanity with spectacle, replacing subtlety with drama, slow intelligence with sudden intervention, and a story about how humans relate to the world with a story about how the world intrudes on humans. This makes the past feel exciting, but it also makes it shallow. It flattens complex cultural systems into simple surprises, turns meaning into novelty, and novelty fades. Meaning endures. That is why these myths are popular but unstable, because they entertain without explaining, fascinate without deepening, and create wonder without understanding. And when wonder fades, there is nothing left. As myths evolve and spread, the original meaning does not disappear. It is simply buried under layers of interpretation, projection, and storytelling. Once buried deeply enough, it begins to feel lost. Not because it is gone, but because we stopped looking for it where it actually is, inside human experience itself. The most striking thing about the Nazca Lines is not that they exist, but that they endure in a world that no longer knows how to speak their language. They remain visible not because we understand them, but because the desert preserves what memory does not. The lines survive as shapes, but the culture that shaped them survives only as fragments. We can measure the lines, map them, photograph them, and analyze them, but none of that tells us how they felt, what they meant, or how they were lived. The physical form remains intact, while the inner meaning has faded, and this separation is the true distance between us and the past. Translation always loses something, but here what is lost is not a word or a sentence. It is an entire way of seeing. The Nazca did not think in the categories we use today. They did not separate science from ritual, function from symbol, psychology from environment. For them, these were not different things. They were layers of the same reality. The lines were at once practical, emotional, symbolic, and social. They were not objects to be studied, but processes to be participated in. When we try to translate them into modern terms, we pull them apart, and in doing so we lose what made them whole. This is why modern explanations feel incomplete, no matter how clever they are. Astronomy explains some alignments, but not the animals. Engineering explains the pukios, but not the walking. Psychology explains trance, but not why that trance mattered. Myth explains belief, but not why it was structured this way. Each explanation takes one thread and calls it the pattern. The Nazca Lines were the pattern of all those threads woven together, and once that weaving is forgotten, no single strand can restore it. What has been lost is not information, but orientation. We no longer know how to stand inside the world the way the Nazca did. We no longer know how to feel time as a cycle instead of a line, how to feel land as a partner instead of a resource, how to feel ritual as participation instead of performance. We look at the lines from outside when they were meant to be entered. We analyze them from above when they were meant to be walked. We speak about them when they were meant to be experienced. The result is a quiet melancholy, not because something is gone, but because something is unreachable. The lines remain, but the way of life that animated them does not. We can visit the desert, but we cannot visit the mindset. We can trace the shapes, but we cannot trace the meaning through the bodies and memories of the people who lived it. The past is not dead, but it is untranslated. This does not mean the lines are empty. It means they are full of a language we no longer speak, a language of movement, patience, attention, and relationship, a language that does not sit in books or monuments, but in rhythms of living. The Nazca wrote that language into the land itself, trusting that land would remember when humans could not. They were right. The desert remembers. We do not. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson hidden in the lines. That meaning is fragile not because it is small, but because it depends on practice. When practice stops, meaning fades. When walking stops, paths become pictures. When listening stops, signals become noise. When relationship stops, symbols become puzzles. The Nazca Lines are not a mystery because they are strange. They are a mystery because they come from a way of being that no longer exists. We do not fail to understand them because they are too complex. We fail to understand them because they are too integrated. They require a kind of attention we no longer train, a kind of patience we no longer practice, and a kind of humility we no longer reward. So the greatest mystery is not what the lines meant. It is why we stopped knowing how to ask. When the Nazca Lines are placed beside other ancient marks across the world, they begin to look less like an anomaly and more like an accent within a much larger human pattern. They are not a singular event in history, but a particularly large and well-preserved example of a behavior that appears again and again across continents and centuries. Humans have repeatedly carved, traced, and shaped the land itself into forms that are too large to be practical and too deliberate to be accidental. From the White Horse of Uffington cut into the hills of England, to the Serpent Mound winding through the earth of North America, to the Geoglyphs of the Atacama Desert, to the song lines of Australia that map memory across distance, the same impulse keeps returning. These cultures did not know one another, did not share language, technology, or belief systems, and lived under entirely different skies and environments. Yet they arrived at a similar idea, that the land itself could become a carrier of meaning. When words felt too fragile, people turned to earth. When memory felt too short, they wrote on stone and soil. When stories felt too invisible, they made them visible at a scale that could outlast generations. This does not suggest a hidden connection between cultures, but a shared human instinct to externalize meaning and anchor ideas into the physical world so they can be returned to, walked through, and remembered not only with the mind but with the body. The land becomes a library without books, a record that does not depend on literacy, and a memory that does not live only inside fragile human minds. Hills become stories, rivers become timelines, and paths become memory, and the landscape stops being neutral and becomes intentional. In England, the chalk horse on the hillside is not just an image, but a place of gathering, ritual, and repetition that has been cleared and re-cleared for thousands of years, turning maintenance into ceremony and preservation into participation. In North America, the Serpent Mound is not just a shape but a path, a story, and a marker of time aligned with celestial events. In Australia, song lines do not draw on the land, but move through it, embedding navigation, history, and identity into routes walked and sung across vast distances. Each culture finds its own expression, but the underlying idea is the same. The Nazca Lines fit into this pattern perfectly. They are not strange because they exist, but because of their scale and preservation. The desert protected them in a way that other environments could not, allowing them to survive without constant maintenance. What feels unique about Nazca is not the idea, but the clarity with which it remains visible. The lines stop feeling alien and start feeling familiar, not evidence of something outside humanity, but evidence of something deeply inside it. A need to connect experience to place, to make meaning durable, and to leave behind something that does not disappear when a single life ends. Humans have always feared forgetting faces, forgetting stories, and forgetting who they were. Writing on the land is a way of resisting that forgetting and telling the future that something mattered enough to shape the world around it. The Nazca were not unique in this impulse, only patient enough to choose a place where the world would not erase them, a medium that would not decay, and silence as their guardian. What remains is not a specific message, not a date, a name, or a command, but the act itself, the act of shaping meaning into matter, trusting land with memory, and believing that what matters inside humans should be reflected outside them. This is the pattern beneath history, not a conspiracy or a shared origin, but a shared instinct. And once we see that instinct, the question shifts from why the Nazca did this to why humans everywhere feel compelled to do it at all. Humans mark the world not because they want to change it, but because they are afraid of losing themselves inside it. From the earliest handprints on cave walls, to names carved into trees, to stones stacked into towers along forgotten paths, the impulse is the same. We leave traces not to dominate the earth, but to ask it to remember us. We do this quietly and instinctively, often without knowing why, because impermanence feels heavier than death itself. To disappear without a trace feels like never having been here at all. The Nazca Lines are an extreme version of this impulse. They are not only cultural artifacts, but emotional ones. They express a longing to become visible to something larger than human memory. They turn fleeting lives into durable shapes. They transform moments into matter. The lines do not preserve individuals, but they preserve the fact that individuals once cared enough to shape the world around them. At the heart of this impulse is continuity. Humans live briefly, but meaning wants to last. We know our time is limited, and that knowledge creates a quiet urgency. We want something of us to remain after we are gone, something that does not decay as quickly as flesh or fade as easily as memory. We want to be held by something larger, slower, and more patient than human time. Mountains endure, rivers persist, stone remembers, so we write ourselves into those things, hoping they will carry what we cannot. This is not vanity, it is vulnerability. We are aware of how small we are. We are aware of how easily we vanish, and we respond by trying to belong to something that outlasts us. The Nazca did this by turning the desert into a memory field. They trusted land with what human minds could not hold for long enough. They placed their care, their attention, and their meaning into the earth itself, believing that while people forget, places remember. This is why the lines feel intimate rather than grand. They are not monuments of power, but gestures of attachment. This instinct appears everywhere. A child writes their name on a desk. A traveler builds a cairn on a mountain. A lover carves initials into bark. These acts do not change the world in any meaningful way. They change how the person feels inside it. They turn anonymity into presence. They turn absence into belonging. They whisper, "I was here," not to others, but to existence itself. The Nazca Lines are that whisper at a civilizational scale. They are not declarations of dominance over nature. They are requests for continuity within it. They say, without words, "Let us remain." They ask the earth not to erase them too quickly. They ask time to slow down just enough to hold their trace. And time, in the desert, listened. This is why the lines feel emotional even when approached analytically. They carry longing. They carry fear. They carry hope. They are shaped not only by hands, but by awareness of mortality. They are made by people who knew they would die, and who responded not with despair, but with patience. This reframes the Nazca from engineers or mystics into something simpler and more familiar. They were humans who did not want to disappear. They were humans who wanted their presence to matter. They were humans who wanted to be remembered by something that would not forget. The lines are not messages to gods or aliens or future civilizations. They are messages to the world itself. And the world answered, not with words, but with preservation. The desert kept what humans placed upon it. It held their lines gently and quietly for centuries. It became their memory when human memory failed. Which brings us to the next step in the story. Because when fear of disappearance becomes central, it naturally leads to attempts at permanence. And permanence, once imagined, changes how humans relate to time, to death, and to the future. The Nazca Lines invite a strange possibility that feels both simple and unsettling, that they were never meant for the sky at all, but for time. Not as a prediction, not as a warning, but as a presence extended forward. The Nazca may not have been speaking upward to gods or outward to strangers, but forward to people they would never meet. In a world where memory fades quickly and stories change with each telling, the land becomes the only medium capable of carrying meaning across centuries. Writing to the future is not about being understood. It is about being known. It is about leaving evidence that someone cared enough to shape the world with intention. The Nazca did not leave names or dates or explanations. They left patterns. Patterns survive translations better than language. A word depends on context. A story depends on culture. A shape depends only on perception. Anyone, anywhere, in any time, can see a line, a spiral, a figure, and feel that it was placed deliberately. The message is not what the shape means, but that meaning exists. In this sense, the Nazca Lines function like a signature written into the earth. Not a personal one, but a collective one. They say, "We were here, and we were paying attention." They do not ask for admiration. They do not demand interpretation. They simply assert presence. They turn a fleeting culture into a durable trace. This reframes the lines not as communications to higher beings, but as communications across time. The Nazca may have understood that while their language would vanish and their rituals would fade, the land would remain. So they placed their thought into the land, trusting that future humans would encounter it even if they could not fully understand it. This is not an attempt to control the future, but to reach it gently. The beauty of this idea is its humility. The Nazca did not imagine themselves as teachers of the future. They did not imagine they would be remembered as important. They simply imagined that someone would one day walk where they walked and notice what they had done. That noticing would be enough. Recognition is a softer form of immortality than fame. In this way, the Nazca Lines become a form of intergenerational conversation. Not a dialogue with answers, but a call without expectation of reply. The future cannot answer the past, but it can witness it. The Nazca offered themselves to be witnessed, trusting that this alone was meaningful. This trust feels deeply human. We all leave traces without knowing who will find them. A photograph in a drawer, a letter in a book, a carving in wood. We rarely expect response. We only hope for continuation. The Nazca Lines are this impulse made vast. They are a hope extended across time that says, "Let this remain," and it has. The lines have remained when cities have collapsed, when languages have disappeared, when names have been forgotten. They have outlived the culture that made them and become visible to people the Nazca could never have imagined. This does not make the Nazca prophetic. It makes them careful. They chose a medium that could survive their absence. This gives the lines a quiet dignity. They are not demands for attention. They are offerings to memory. They are gifts placed into the future without knowing who would unwrap them. They are acts of generosity toward time itself. And yet, there is a subtle sadness here too, because writing to the future implies the expectation of loss. It implies knowing that what you are will not last. It implies acceptance of impermanence alongside a desire to soften it. The Nazca did not deny death. They worked around it. They wrote not to avoid disappearing, but to leave something that could persist beyond their disappearance. They accepted that they would vanish. They refused to vanish completely, and in doing so, they gave us a final gift, not an answer, not a lesson, not a command, but a presence that says, across centuries of silence, that humans once stood here, paid attention, and cared enough to leave a trace. Which brings the story to its next turning point. Because once we see the lines as messages to the future, we also have to face what happens when futures do not arrive as hoped. When cultures fail, when memory breaks, when traces remain, but the world that made them does not. The desert does not change quickly, but when it does, it changes everything. For generations, the Nazca had lived within a fragile balance, learning how to read subtle signals in wind, soil, and sky, learning how to guide water from hidden places beneath the earth, and learning how to shape meaning into ritual that made uncertainty bearable. This balance did not guarantee safety, but it offered continuity. It allowed life to persist in a place that should not easily support it. And then, slowly, that continuity began to break. Climate does not announce itself with drama. It drifts, it shifts, it moves in increments too small to feel in a single season, but large enough to reshape centuries. Rains that once arrived occasionally became rarer. Rivers that once flowed briefly began to dry earlier each year. Underground water that had been steady began to fall. The desert grew slightly warmer, slightly drier, slightly less forgiving. None of this would have been obvious at first. It would have felt like bad years instead of a new reality. But bad years accumulate. Crops failed more often. Hunger stretched longer into seasons. Children weakened. Elders worried. The rituals continued. The lines were walked. The offerings were made. But the response of the world grew quieter. The sky did not open as it once had. The land did not soften. The balance that had held for generations began to tilt. In such moments, humans do not abandon belief. They intensify it. When uncertainty rises, ritual deepens. When fear grows, meaning becomes more precious. The Nazca would have walked their lines more often, gathered more carefully, and focused more intently. They would have turned toward the systems that had sustained them in the past, hoping that repetition could restore what was slipping away. But repetition cannot always reverse change. The world does not promise stability. It promises only motion. And motion does not always move in directions that favor survival. Over time, the droughts would have become undeniable, not as an event, but as a pattern. The land stopped responding in the ways it once had. The pukios yielded less water. Fields produced less grain. Animals became harder to sustain. Migration became a consideration rather than a tragedy. Some families would leave first, seeking better land elsewhere. Others would stay, hoping the cycle would turn back. It did not. This is how civilizations end, not with collapse, but with thinning, with people leaving quietly, with gatherings growing smaller, with rituals becoming echoes of what they once were. The lines remained, but fewer feet walked them. The symbols stayed, but fewer minds felt them. The system did not break, it emptied. The Nazca Lines outlived the Nazca because stone and dust endure longer than societies. The desert kept the shapes long after the hands that shaped them were gone. What remained was not failure, but residue. Evidence that something once worked here, and that it stopped working not because it was wrong, but because the world changed around it. This reframes the end of the Nazca not as a mystery, but as a story we recognize everywhere. Humans build systems suited to a world as it is, and when that world becomes something else, the systems struggle to adapt. The Nazca were not defeated by enemies. They were not conquered by armies. They were undone by the slow movement of climate beyond their control. There is no villain in this story. There is only impermanence. The desert did not betray them. It simply changed. The sky did not refuse them. It simply moved. The Nazca did not fail. They were outpaced by time. This is why their story feels tragic but not hopeless. It does not warn us about arrogance. It reminds us about humility. It reminds us that survival is always provisional, that balance is always temporary, and that even the most careful relationships with the world can be undone by forces beyond understanding or negotiation. They carved prayers into the earth, and the earth did not answer. Not because it was cruel, but because it does not answer. It moves, it shifts, it changes its rhythms without asking permission. The Nazca listened as long as listening was enough, and when it was no longer enough, they did what humans have always done. They moved, they adapted, they faded. And what remained was the trace of their attention written into the land, waiting quietly for others to notice it long after they were gone. For a long time, the Nazca had lived inside a world that made sense, not because it was predictable, but because it was interpretable. The lines could be walked, the rituals could be performed, and the symbols could be read. Even when the sky withheld rain, the act of asking still felt meaningful, because it created coherence in uncertainty and gave people a way to respond when nothing else could be done. Belief did not guarantee survival, but it gave survival a shape. When droughts deepened and water became scarce beyond anything remembered, the old rhythms stopped producing the old results. The lines were walked, but the rains did not return. The offerings were made, but the fields stayed dry. The sky no longer responded in the ways it once seemed to. This did not immediately destroy belief, but unsettled it by introducing doubt where there had been trust and confusion, where there had been order. At first, people assume they are doing something wrong, so they walk more carefully, repeat rituals more precisely, and add layers of meaning, more symbols, more prayers, and more intensity. Faith deepens when it is threatened, and the Nazca would have tried harder, not less, walking longer, gathering more often, and focusing more intently on the forms that had once sustained them. But effort does not always restore alignment, and over time repetition without response becomes strain, and strain becomes fracture. People begin to ask quiet questions, not out loud at first but inside themselves, about why nothing is changing, why the world no longer seems to listen, and why the patterns no longer work. These questions weaken the coherence that holds societies together, and once coherence weakens, unity weakens as well. Not everyone doubts at the same pace, and while some hold on harder, others let go earlier. Some reinterpret the failure as punishment, some as abandonment, some as a sign to leave, and others as a sign to stay, until meaning no longer flows in one direction, but splinters into many. As explanations diverge, behaviors diverge, and the society that was once synchronized becomes asynchronous. People no longer walk together in the same way. Rituals feel forced rather than natural. Participation becomes obligation rather than belonging. And the lines that once guided movement now highlight difference because not everyone wants to walk them anymore. Some still do out of loyalty, fear, or hope, while others stop out of grief, anger, or exhaustion. And others leave entirely in search of new land, new systems, and new meanings. This is not rebellion but disorientation. Because when the stories that once explained reality no longer do, people lose their sense of place within it. They no longer know how to interpret suffering, justify effort, or trust the future. And without interpretation, experience becomes raw, and without narrative, hardship becomes unbearable. This is when societies begin to empty, not because people are forced out, but because meaning no longer holds them in place. The Nazca did not abandon their world because they stopped believing, but because belief stopped working. And this distinction matters because it shows they did not become cynical, but untethered. The lines no longer felt alive, the rituals no longer felt responsive, and the land no longer felt in conversation with them, and without conversation, there is no relationship, only presence, survival, and movement. So people moved. Families drifted away in different directions, communities thinned, gatherings grew smaller, and the system did not fall apart so much as it faded, leaving behind shapes without walkers, symbols without interpreters, and paths without purpose. This is the quiet end of meaning, not destruction or collapse, but forgetting. And when meaning breaks, place becomes empty. And when place becomes empty, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a ruin. After the people left, the land did not change, and that was the most unsettling part. The desert did not reclaim the lines, did not erase them, and did not soften them back into randomness. It simply held them where they were, pale and quiet, as if waiting for footsteps that would never return. The paths remained clear, not because they were used, but because nothing in the desert was strong enough to undo them. Wind passed over them without rearranging their edges, sun bleached them without blurring their shape, and time itself seemed to move around them rather than through them. This turned the lines into something strange. They were no longer tools, no longer symbols, and no longer part of a living system. They became traces without users, patterns without participants, and gestures without recipients. The land became a memory of movement rather than a space of movement itself. What had once been active became archival, and what had once been meaningful became mute. In this silence, the lines took on a new kind of presence. They were not empty, but they were no longer full. They held the shape of attention without the attention itself, and they carried the outline of ritual without the ritual being performed. They were containers without content, waiting not for people, but for time to decide what they would become next. Generations passed without anyone walking the paths with intention. Children grew up elsewhere. Stories were told in other languages, in other landscapes, under other skies, and the lines did not follow. They stayed where they were, faithful to a world that had moved on, and in doing so they became something neither human nor natural, but a quiet intersection between the two. This is what ruins are, not broken things, but abandoned relationships, a temple without worshippers, a road without travelers, and a song without singers. The Nazca Lines became ruins of behavior rather than ruins of stone, marking the place where a way of being had once existed and then withdrawn. There is a particular sadness in this kind of survival, because the lines survived not because they were essential, but because they were unnecessary. No one needed to alter them, no one needed to erase them, and they were no longer part of any struggle or system or survival strategy. They had been released from use, and in that release they were preserved. This is why the lines lasted, not because they were strong, but because they were left alone. Most things endure because they are defended, repaired, or remembered. But the Nazca Lines endured because they were forgotten. The desert did not value them, it simply did not disturb them. And in that indifference, the lines found a strange form of immortality. This turns abandonment into preservation and forgetting into protection. The world did not save the lines out of respect, but out of absence. The people who left them behind never intended this outcome, and they did not walk away thinking their traces would become eternal. They walked away because they had no choice, because survival demanded it, and yet their leaving created the conditions for their memory to last. The lines became a gift not from intention, but from necessity. They were not guarded by caretakers, but by emptiness, and they were not maintained by ritual, but by silence. This is why the modern world encounters the lines as mysteries rather than memories, because we do not inherit their meaning, only their form. We find them intact but empty, precise but unexplained, beautiful but disconnected from the life that once animated them. And we stand where others once walked, but we do not walk in the same way. The lines feel ancient not because they are old, but because they are alone, and in that aloneness they wait, not for the return of their makers, but for new eyes, new questions, and new stories. And that is where the final phase begins, because after centuries of silence, the lines were finally seen again. Modern humans are trained to see mechanisms, to ask how things work before asking why they exist, and to reduce complexity into measurable parts. This way of thinking has given us extraordinary power over the physical world, but it has also reshaped how we interpret meaning. When we encounter something we do not understand, we reach for tools, processes, and technologies to explain it. We search for function before intention and structure before story, which makes us excellent engineers, but poor translators of symbolic worlds. When we look at ancient landscapes shaped by ritual and belief, we instinctively search for machines. We ask what tool could have made this, what device could have produced that, and what technology could explain such scale or precision. We assume complexity requires machinery, and that intelligence must look like engineering. And in doing so, we overlook the possibility that intelligence can also look like patience, coordination, memory, and shared meaning. The Nazca Lines suffer under this gaze because we examine them as if they were artifacts of construction rather than artifacts of consciousness, measuring their length, analyzing their angles, and mapping their alignments in the hope that geometry alone will unlock their secret. But the secret is not hidden in the geometry itself. It is hidden in the way humans once related to geometry. To the Nazca, lines were not objects, but experiences, ways of walking, waiting, gathering, and paying attention. Not tools to manipulate the world, but tools to shape the self. A machine changes the external world, while a symbol changes the internal world, and modern thinking privileges the first while dismissing the second as unimportant or unscientific. Even though, for most of human history, internal transformation was as important as external control. The Nazca did not seek to master nature, they sought to align with it. They did not seek to extract resources, they sought to understand patterns. When we look for machines, we look for control, but when they looked for meaning, they looked for relationship. This is why we misunderstand so much of the ancient world, because we project our priorities backward and then feel confused when they do not fit. We imagine engines where there were rituals, technicians where there were priests, devices where there were dances, and we turn metaphors into mechanisms and stories into schematics. This projection does not come from arrogance so much as from familiarity. We know how machines work, but we do not know how shared meaning works. We know how to build structures, but we do not know how to build coherence, so we assume coherence must be a structure too. But coherence is not built, it is grown, emerging from repetition, attention, and participation. The Nazca cultivated coherence in the desert by creating a world in which behavior, belief, and environment were synchronized, building not things to use, but experiences to live inside. This is difficult for modern minds to see, because we live in a world where experiences are consumed rather than created. We move through designed spaces without shaping them, follow systems without understanding them, and inherit meaning rather than making it. When we fail to see this, we reach for explanations that feel comfortable, imagining lost technologies, outside intervention, or secrets hidden in plain sight, because these explanations allow us to preserve our sense of modern superiority while still enjoying ancient mystery. They let us say that the past required help instead of admitting that it worked in a way we no longer understand. This protects our identity, but it limits our insight, because the real difference between us and them is not technology, but orientation. We face outward while they faced inward. We change the world to suit ourselves while they change themselves to suit the world. And neither is wrong, but confusing one for the other leads to misunderstanding. And misunderstanding leads to projection, which brings us to the next step in the story, because when we misunderstand the past, we begin to fill it with ourselves. There is a quiet discomfort hidden beneath many modern explanations of the ancient world, not fear of the unknown, but unease with the familiar. We are often more comfortable imagining that something extraordinary came from elsewhere than accepting that it emerged from ourselves. When we encounter achievements that feel too large, too subtle, or too different from our expectations, we reach outward for explanation rather than inward, looking for visitors, interventions, or influences beyond humanity, because it feels safer to locate wonder outside ourselves than to confront it within. This is not arrogance so much as vulnerability, because to acknowledge forgotten human brilliance is to admit that intelligence does not belong to one era, one culture, or one set of tools. It is to admit that people without our machines, our science, or our language were capable of things we no longer understand how to do, and this unsettles the story we tell ourselves about progress. We prefer to believe that the present is the peak, that the past was a climb toward us, and that knowledge accumulates rather than transforms. And aliens offer a convenient alternative by preserving the idea of linear progress while allowing us to admire the past without threatening the present. There is also psychological comfort in imagining benevolent outsiders, because it allows us to believe that intelligence is universal and friendly, that someone else once cared enough to help us, guide us, or uplift us, and this softens the loneliness of being human in a vast universe. But this comfort comes at a cost, because it removes agency from our ancestors, turns human creativity into borrowed achievement, and empties cultures of their own depth in order to fill them with our fantasies, turning the Nazca Lines into landing strips rather than language, navigation rather than narrative, and engineering rather than expression. We do this not because we want to diminish the past, but because we want to protect the present. Since if ancient people were as intelligent, perceptive, and capable as we are, our uniqueness fades. And if they solved problems we no longer know how to solve, progress becomes less certain. And if they lived meaningfully without our technologies lose some of their authority. So we give the credit away to aliens, to lost civilizations, to vanished technologies, to anyone but the people who actually live there. This externalization of wonder keeps human history tidy by dividing time into primitive, then, and advanced now, instead of seeing intelligence as something that takes different forms in different contexts, and it lets us admire ancient achievements without feeling challenged by them. But the truth is more complex and more beautiful, because human intelligence is not a ladder, but a landscape, growing in some places and fading in others, expressing itself through tools in one era and through symbols in another. The Nazca did not lack intelligence. They expressed it differently, building with attention instead of steel, engineering with ritual instead of machines, and encoding knowledge into movement and space, rather than into devices and data. To attribute this to aliens is to miss what is most extraordinary about it, that humans did this, that humans imagined this, and that humans sustain this. It is not safer to believe in aliens. It is simply easier than admitting that humanity is capable of depths we do not always recognize, and forms of brilliance we no longer easily access. And once we see that, the projection falls away, leaving not mystery but reflection, where we stop asking who helped them and start asking what they knew, which is where the story finally turns inward, toward ourselves. The world has never stopped speaking, but we have slowly forgotten how to listen. Not because the language vanished, but because our attention moved elsewhere. We learned to read screens, charts, and codes, and in doing so we lost fluency in reading land, sky, and rhythm. We replaced pattern with data, meaning with measurement, and relationship with control. None of this is wrong, but something subtle was traded away in the process, a way of noticing that once made the world feel alive rather than useful. Symbolic literacy is not about believing in myths or abandoning science. It is about recovering the ability to perceive meaning without immediately reducing it to mechanism. It is the skill of noticing not just what something does, but what it expresses. A sunrise is not only light interacting with atmosphere, it is also a beginning that humans have marked, honored, and remembered for as long as we have been human. A river is not only flowing water, it is also a path, a boundary, a source, and a story. These layers do not compete with one another. They coexist. The Nazca Lines remind us of this layered way of seeing. They ask us not just to observe, but to participate, not just to analyze, but to feel. They invite us to imagine that the land can be read, not as text, but as conversation. That meaning can be embedded into space, not as instruction, but as relationship. That the world is not only a system to be understood, but a presence to be engaged. To read the world this way is not to abandon reason. It is to expand it. It is to allow room for patterns that do not resolve into equations, for truths that are felt before they are proven, and for connections that cannot be diagrammed without losing what makes them alive. It is to remember that human understanding has always been more than technical. It has been emotional, relational, and symbolic as well. When we lose this literacy, the world becomes flat. Everything becomes a resource, a problem, or a machine. Forests become timber, rivers become utilities, animals become data, and people become statistics. We gain power, but we lose intimacy. We gain efficiency, but we lose reverence. The world becomes quieter, not because it speaks less, but because we listen less. The Nazca did not build machines to extract value from the land. They built relationships with it. They paid attention to its rhythms, its limits, its signals, and its moods. They responded with care, ritual, and patience. Their lines were not just marks, but acknowledgments. They said, in form rather than words, that the world mattered enough to be noticed. Remembering how to read the world does not mean returning to the past. It means integrating what the past knew with what the present knows. It means holding science and symbolism together rather than apart. It means allowing ourselves to experience wonder without immediately translating it into function, and to experience meaning without immediately demanding proof. This is not regression. It is maturity. A child sees the world as alive. An adult learns to see it as a system. A wiser adult learns to see it as both. The Nazca Lines do not ask us to believe what the Nazca believed. They ask us to remember how the Nazca saw. They ask us to recover a way of paying attention that makes the world feel responsive rather than inert, relational rather than empty, and meaningful rather than random. The mystery was never in the desert. It was in us, in our capacity to notice, in our willingness to listen, in our courage to care. The lines did not lose their meaning. We lost our fluency, And fluency can be relearned by walking slowly, by noticing patterns, by asking not only how things work, but why they matter, by remembering that the world is not just something we live on, but something we live with. That is what the lines still whisper. And that is what they have been whispering all along. Every mystery invites a certain kind of attention. At first, it asks to be solved, measured, classified, and placed into a category that makes it feel manageable. The Nazca Lines have been approached this way for decades, analyzed as art, as engineering, as astronomy, as myth, and as anomaly. Each approach adds something, but none of them feel complete, because the lines themselves are not only objects, they are expressions, and expressions do not exist to be reduced, they exist to be related to. The longer one stays with the lines, the more the original question quietly shifts, from what are they to what do they reveal. This shift changes everything. Instead of asking what kind of people could make something like this, we begin asking what kind of people would feel the need to. Instead of asking how they were built, we ask why building them mattered. Instead of treating the lines as a problem to be solved, we treat them as a mirror, reflecting something about human psychology, human longing, and human ways of making sense of a fragile world. The lines stop being the subject and become the lens. Seen this way, the Nazca Lines reveal that humans do not live only in physical environments. They live in meaning. They build structures not only to survive, but to interpret survival. They shape landscapes not only to extract resources, but to encode relationships, values, fears, and hopes into something that can be shared, repeated, and remembered. The lines show that humans do not only ask how to live, but how to live in a way that feels coherent, oriented, and significant. They reveal a species that is deeply uncomfortable with randomness. Humans want to feel that life is not just a sequence of events, but a story with shape, rhythm, and direction. When the world feels uncertain, we respond not only with tools, but with symbols. We draw lines, tell stories, perform rituals, and build patterns that give the chaos a frame. The Nazca Lines are this impulse made visible. They are order offered to a world that does not promise it. They also reveal how much humans need continuity. We fear disappearance, not only of our bodies, but of our meaning. We want something of us to persist beyond our brief lives, something that says we were here and that being here mattered. The lines are a form of this persistence, a way of leaving behind not a name or a monument, but a trace of attention. They say that humans once stood here and cared enough to shape the world around them. They reveal how deeply humans depend on relationship. The Nazca did not treat the world as an object to be controlled, but as a presence to be engaged. Their lines were conversations, not commands, ways of listening and responding rather than imposing and extracting. This shows a form of intelligence that is not competitive, but cooperative, not dominating, but adaptive. It is a reminder that there are ways of being human that do not revolve around conquest or control, but around alignment and care. They reveal how meaning and survival are intertwined. The lines were not built instead of practical systems, but alongside them. The Nazca engineered water and encoded ritual, managed resources, and shaped belief. They did not separate the technical from the symbolic, because for them both were necessary for life to continue. This reveals that humans do not survive on food and water alone, but on coherence, hope, and shared understanding. And they reveal how fragile all of this is. When the world changed, when the rains stopped and the systems failed, the meaning structures cracked as well. The lines could not save the culture that made them, and yet they preserved the evidence that such a culture once existed. This reveals a quiet truth about humanity, that our creations outlast us, but our ways of living do not. and that what we leave behind often matters more than what we accomplish. So, the Nazca Lines are not asking to be explained. They are asking to be understood. They are asking us to see ourselves in them, not as we are now, but as we have always been, meaning-making creatures living in an unpredictable world, trying to shape that unpredictability into something that feels livable. They invite us to recognize that behind every mystery is not just a question about the past, but a question about the present, about what we value, what we fear, what we hope for, and what we choose to leave behind. The question beneath the question is not what the lines are. It is what they say about us, and what they ask of us in return. Meaning is not a thing that can be stored the way stone can be stored, or preserved the way shapes can be preserved. It is a process that lives only while it is practiced. It exists in attention, in repetition, in relationship, and in memory. And when those fade, meaning fades with them. This is why the Nazca Lines remain visible while their language does not. The lines were written into the land, but the understanding of them was written into people. And people do not endure the way deserts do. The Nazca did not lose their meaning because it was weak, but because it was alive. Living things depend on renewal. They must be cared for, repeated, inhabited, and passed on. When walking stopped, the lines became shapes instead of paths. When ritual stopped, the symbols became images instead of experiences. When stories stopped being told, the lines stopped being read and began only to be seen. The transformation was quiet, but it was complete. What remained was form without function, presence without participation. This is the paradox of preservation. We are very good at saving objects, but not very good at saving relationships. We can protect buildings, protect texts, protect artifacts, and protect landscapes, but we cannot protect the way those things were felt, lived, and understood. Museums can hold tools, but they cannot hold habits. Archives can hold words, but they cannot hold ways of listening. The lines survived because they were physical. Their meaning disappeared because it was experiential. This is not a failure of history. It is a condition of being human. Every culture leaves behind far more than it can carry forward. Most of what matters is not designed to last because it exists in movement, in breath, in timing, and in shared presence. It exists in things that cannot be frozen without being changed. When a culture ends, what is lost is not only its knowledge, but its way of being, and ways of being do not fossilize. This is why ancient sites feel both powerful and empty. They are full of traces but hollow of context. They are complete in form but incomplete in meaning. We can walk where others walked, but we cannot walk as they walked. We can see what they made, but not why they made it in the way they did. The world gives us their handwriting, but not their voice. And handwriting without voice becomes a puzzle instead of a conversation. The Nazca Lines show us that meaning is fragile, not because it is trivial, but because it is relational. It depends on people noticing the same things together, caring about the same patterns, and repeating the same gestures over time. When those people are gone, meaning has nowhere to live. The lines cannot carry it alone. They can only point to where it once existed. This realization carries a quiet sadness, but also a quiet clarity. It reminds us that meaning is not something we inherit automatically. It is something we practice or lose. It asks us to notice what in our own world depends on renewal, on attention, on shared care, and what we are allowing to fade because we assume it will last without us. The Nazca did not assume that meaning would last. They practiced it. We assume it will last, and so we often do not. This is the fragile truth beneath the lines. They are not reminders of what was built, but of what was lived. They show us that cultures do not die when people die, but when practices stop. They show us that forgetting is not an act, but an absence, and they leave us with a responsibility that is not about preserving things, but about preserving ways of seeing, listening, and relating that give those things their life. We preserved the lines, but we lost the language, and that loss is not in the past, it is always happening in the present. Every generation forgets something it does not choose to renew. Every society leaves behind meanings it no longer knows how to carry. The Nazca Lines are not only a story about what was lost long ago, they are a mirror held up to us, asking what we are losing now, quietly, while we are busy preserving the wrong things. Every culture writes itself into the world, whether it intends to or not. The marks we leave behind are not only the things we build, but the patterns we repeat, the systems we rely on, and the values we embed into our surroundings. Long after our voices fade, those patterns will remain, waiting to be noticed by people we cannot imagine and understood in ways we cannot predict. The Nazca Lines remind us that what survives is rarely what we expect, and that what lasts longest is often what feels most ordinary while it is being lived. We tend to think of legacy as something grand, something chosen, something monumental. But most of what we leave behind is accidental. It is the shape of our cities, the scars on our landscapes, the traces of our technology, and the rhythms of our consumption. It is the way we reshape rivers, cut forests, pave earth, and fill air with sound and signal. We are carving our story into the planet just as surely as the Nazca carved theirs into the desert. But we are doing it without the quiet care that made their traces feel intentional. We are leaving behind not a single message, but a field of signals. Future observers will not hear our debates or understand our languages. They will see what remains. They will see layers of plastic in sediment. They will see cities reduced to outlines, coastlines shifted by rising seas, and climates altered by invisible gases we barely notice now. They will see patterns in our infrastructure, in our waste, in our energy use, and in the way we rearranged the surface of the earth to suit ourselves. They will read us not through our words, but through our consequences. And they will ask what we were trying to say. Were we trying to say that speed mattered more than stability, that growth mattered more than balance, that convenience mattered more than continuity, that extraction mattered more than relationship? Or were we trying to say something else and failed to notice how loudly our actions were speaking on our behalf? The future will not judge our intentions. It will only inherit our results. This is the uncomfortable lesson hidden inside the Nazca Lines. The Nazca did not know who would see their work. They did not know how it would be interpreted. They only knew that they were placing something into time. We are doing the same thing now, whether we choose to or not. Every road, every network, every system, every habit becomes part of the record. We are writing to the future with everything we do. The question is not whether we are leaving a message. The question is what kind of message it is. Is it coherent or chaotic? Is it careful or careless? Is it something that speaks of relationship or something that speaks of domination? Is it something that shows attention or something that shows haste? The Nazca wrote with patience. We write with speed. The Nazca wrote with restraint. We write with excess. The contrast is not moral, but temporal. It reflects the different worlds we inhabit and the different pressures we respond to. But the responsibility remains the same. What we shape will shape those who come after us. What we normalize will feel natural to them. What we leave unresolved will become their inheritance. This does not mean we should aim for perfection or purity or some imagined ideal past. It means we should aim for awareness. It means recognizing that we are not only living our lives, we are inscribing them. We are leaving behind a story, whether we intend to tell one or not. The Nazca Lines were not instructions. They were gestures. They were signs of attention, care, and presence. They said, without words, that the world mattered enough to be shaped thoughtfully. The future may never understand what they meant, but it can feel how they were made. That feeling has survived longer than any explanation could have. Perhaps that is the real lesson, not to control what the future will think, but to care about how the future will feel, when it stands where we stood, when it walks what we built, when it lives inside what we leave behind. So the question beneath the question becomes very simple. Not what will we leave behind, but how will what we leave behind speak, and what will it say about who we were?